You're talking about different processing and whether it be fermentation or the five-step process for corn. It gets me thinking about us here in the West and some of the biggest foods that we're consuming, not knowing that we're not processing them in a healthful way. And it might even be a healthy food if it is done properly. So, what I'm getting at here is what are some of the foods that we're consuming, assuming they're healthy, besides the tomato and the corn, that need to be processed differently to become a healthful food for us?
That is such a good question, and it is almost all of them. Aside from, say, meat and seafood, it really is almost all of them. So, uh, so for instance, all of the top allergens, for the most part, are coming from this category. You take soy. Now, soy was not a food until about 1,000 years ago, the time of the Yellow Emperor, when a farmer discovered that if you fermented it for 6 months, folks, then it didn't cause harm. From there on, it started to spread as a condiment, not as a protein staple, right? People were not eating edamame as an appetizer, and they were not having soy protein as a meat substitute, right? This was a topping, a flavor additive, and it was properly fermented. In that way, not causing problems. The fermentation for soy is really quite required due to the lectin. There are toxic lectins and non-toxic lectins, and unfortunately in scientific literature, we do not have a word to discern them. So just know if I speak of lectins, I'm only speaking of the toxic ones. There are lots of non-toxic lectins that exist in plants that are perfectly fine for us. So that fermentation neutralizes it. Now, if you go for sushi, let's say you want some sashimi tonight, the soy sauce that's served on the table is not fermented like that. And in fact, almost none is. If you ask for the tamari, which is the gluten-free ferment, that's going to be properly fermented, not as long as I would like. Really, the long ferment is quite expensive, but it is much better. It's going to have a lower lectin content. But again, you go to these restaurants, you're probably going to have tofu and other large quantities of soy. So that would be one. Another would be something like an egg yolk. Now, eggs traditionally were not a problem, but they really started to become a high allergen food when the birds, the chickens, their diet was changed, essentially. So it became the bulk of the diet came from corn, soy, these kind of foods. Now, a chicken or bird is very different than a mammal, and they can typically handle a good amount of lectins. They can even handle about 70% of their diet from a lectin food, like a corn, and be fine, really, truly fine. But when it's 100%, that is a very different story. And at that stage, when they're not outside picking at the bugs, they really should be eating bugs and shells and all sorts of things. When they're not, then they put that lectin toxin into their fat. And so anything fatty, like an egg yolk or skin, is going to have more of that. And that's going to come to us. That's going to trigger our immune system. And those of us that are more vulnerable or had a rough birth or had more antibiotics, there's so many factors. But those of us that are more sensitive are going to notice it. That doesn't take away the fact that all of us have issues with these lectins. Some of us are just going to notice it faster.
All right, you gave a couple examples there. And as you're talking about the soy, it got me thinking about taking that to the extreme. And a lot of times, people on a plant based diet use that as the base for their protein needs. So I can only imagine over time what that would do to the body.
Exactly. And it also acts on the hormonal system as well, which is very problematic. But it's not the only one. Let's say you do rice protein isolate, right? And you use that instead as a vegetarian or as a vegan. That's going to block your B1. And pretty soon you're going to start to have nerve issues, whether that comes out as high lactic acid, so you're getting anxious and insomnia and you're sore everywhere, or you come down with a real demyelination of the nerves. It will come because you don't really have B1 in your diet and you're blocking it with the rice protein. So the way that we're consuming the foods matters just as much as what the food is. And it's very difficult, at least from my background, to say that a food is blanket good or bad, because it really is a very different food if it's been processed in the ancestral way, and if it's not, and also what it's eaten with in conjunction.
Okay, so what it's eaten with matters, the way it's processed, and when it comes to animal foods, what those animals ate. You gave the chicken example there. I'm assuming to bring that over to the plant realm, we need to look at the soil quality and the plants that have been processed properly and are eaten with the right things. I'm assuming they would have to be grown in the right soil to have proper nutrition.
Yes, definitely. They would. Now, they don't get the toxin load from the soil. So there are some that do. For instance, mushrooms can get oxalates from the soil. But to be honest, that's a bit mysterious. So you take that with a grain of salt, because I think there's more going on there. But in general, the soil gives the plants the vitamins, the minerals. And so now our soil is rather sad. And so we're getting about, I think it's about a 15th of the amount of the vitamins that we were 50 years ago from the same amount of food. And so, yeah, the soil is a major issue, but you couple that deficiency within the food, even if you feel like you're eating the best whole food diet, with then also eating foods that block those same vitamins and minerals, and that's where we get into real trouble.
We'll talk about what some of those foods are that we need to be aware of when we're consuming them with nutrient dense foods.
Yes. So if you're consuming a lot of, say, lectin-rich foods like the tomatoes, bell peppers, all of those, you really need very specific glyconutrients in your diet and at all meals. Glyconutrients are long chain sugars, but don't think sweet. They're not. They're medical sugars. And they're very good for multiple functions in the body. This kind of new craze for all the Asian mushrooms and having that instead of coffee, those have some of them. But there are 8 different glyconutrients, and you really need all of them if you're eating those kind of foods to help to buffer the immune system and the nervous system from getting damaged within the gut lining when you consume those. So those would be very important. Some of those are very basic. They're found in things like onions and garlic. Many in the carnivore world, you can get it from bone marrow, from shrimp shells, and all sorts of things. So whey protein has it too. Not the whey protein, I mean, technically, yes, the bodybuilder whey protein, yes, but the traditional form is a liquid, and you get it from the cheese making process. So you get it from that too. So all of those kind of new foods that are hitting the market, colostrum, I've been seeing tons of ads for. That's been a known glyconutrient for a very long time. So the more of those you have, the more buffer you have. So those are always a good idea. With other plant toxins like oxalates, dairy is the key. So dairy really blocks that. Oxalates are crystalline structures that are found in things like raw spinach, but also cooked. Cooked still has far more than you can break down in a week. So quite a bit. And when you have that food with dairy, it helps to buffer it. So that can be really good. For those on a carnivore diet, not doing dairy, lemon juice would do the trick. Now, lemon juice traditionally was always allowed on carnivore diets that were used medically. The real medical way to do the carnivore diet was not so puritanical. It was more about not having fiber. So you could have herbal teas if you did okay with them, and you could do lemon juice and things like that. So that would be an option.
So you mentioned when it comes to oxalates, the dairy being the buffer. I just want to understand the lemon juice part. So when you're having a carnivore diet, what oxalates would you be taking in that you need to buffer?
Well, you can still get them, absolutely. And if you're an endogenous producer as well, some people produce them on their own. It's a small subset of the population, but we're starting to see it more and more. And so if you have that as well, that can be helpful. Now, it's not just producing them. So even if you stop eating oxalates, that's often when you get the worst, because your body will get excited and start to get rid of them. And that can cause genuinely very severe symptoms, especially in those who are prone to pH balance issues in the blood. So those with seizures, kidney disease, these kind of conditions, they can go into a state of sepsis very quickly, actually. And so you can start dumping at a rate that your body can't handle or can't get rid of. And so for that, the lemon juice will help with with dealing with that. But it does not work that way when you're eating vegetables and fruit. So that really does only work when you're on a true carnivore diet.
Got it. So to clarify there, it's when you're dumping, if you're on a carnivore diet, or the endogenous oxalates that you're producing with the lemon
That's
juice.
correct. Hmm.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
What the Blue Zone is selling fits with the narrative of what we've heard really since the food pyramid and promotes that further. We tend to be like, okay, I'm going to have this organ and nothing else. That's not the ancestral way. The ancestral way would be